Perhaps one of the most unique selection tools in Photoshop is the pen tool. Now the pen tool sets itself apart from all other selection tools because it actually creates selections differently. It uses paths in order to create a selection. And if you've never heard of paths before, don't worry yourself. We're not going to get too technical or go into too much detail, but we might save that for a future video. So to start out with, if we go to the tools menu on the left hand side here, you'll notice just about halfway down, or just over halfway down, you'll see the pen tool. Now you can press P on your keyboard to bring it up, or just click on the mouse. Now if you hold down the icon itself, you'll also notice that there are a series of other pen tool related icons or other tools underneath the pen tool that you can also utilize when creating selections. But for this particular tutorial, we're just going to stick to the pen tool. So I'm going to select that, and what you'll notice is up in the top options bar here we have a series of different settings and configurations that you can choose from. Now the one you want to really pay attention to is this area here. You want to make sure that you have the centered one, or the middle one, selected, and that's called paths, because that's what's primarily going to be creating our selection from. Now if you select either of the other two, they do slightly similar but different. They actually act in a different manner. In some cases they actually, for example, will fill your selection with a solid color, which you don't necessarily want, just for example. So you really want to make sure that you have paths selected here. And then you have the option of actually selecting the pen tool or selecting a freeform pen tool. Now I recommend you leave it on the pen tool. The freeform just allows you to draw around the image, as we'll just quickly demonstrate. Undo that. Select the freeform tool. What it just allows you to do is basically draw around the image like this in order to make your selections, and it's not really what you want, because it can be a little bit difficult to maintain your edges when you're actually just going freehand. So we'll just undo that. So we want to leave it on the pen tool, and then you have a series of other options here, and these are essentially shapes that you can create that are based on paths. We're not really going to be utilizing any of these because we're going to be creating a custom shape or custom selection based on this jetty that I have in this particular photograph, but they're just handy to know that they're there if you ever want to create rectangles, or rectangles with round corners, or ellipses and whatnot. Now you also have a checkbox for auto add and delete, so you can leave that checked. And then you have a series of other options here, from actually creating adding a new path, to actually subtracting from a path, to intersecting path areas, and also excluding overlapped path areas. So that's very similar to the selection options that you see with most selection tools, where you're creating a new selection or adding to the selection or subtracting from the selection, except in this case you're actually using paths. So what exactly is a path? Let me just quickly demonstrate. A path is essentially based on lines. So you essentially work your way around the area of the canvas, and you just click on the spots that you want to select, and then you need to essentially join up your path. So now that I have that actually joined up, you'll notice that it's based essentially on lines. Now, without getting into too much detail or specifics, paths essentially are vector based. So they're based on lines, which means if I was to actually zoom in on this particular path, you'll notice that the path will remain solid, but the image will start to pixelize. So essentially paths are vector based. So if you were to blow them up to billboard size, you could essentially have pin sharp letters and shapes and selections, whereas pixel-based selections, which are called raster, you'd notice the pixelization as you start to blow it up, because they're made of pixels as opposed to lines. So that's a really brief sort of explanation of the two. Don't worry yourself too much about it, because it's not terribly important at this stage. So I'm going to go and actually back onto the pen tool, and what you can do once you've actually created a path, to create a selection, you essentially right click on the actual path area that you've created, and you want to go make selection. And then from here we have a series of make selection options from the rendering, where you can actually specify a feathering radius. You can also choose to have anti-alias checked, and you can also choose the operation, which in most cases is going to be new selection, unless you're actually adding multiple paths and creating multiple selections on the one canvas. And once you click OK, you'll notice now I have a selection. So that's essentially how the path tool works. But now let's actually create a selection that we can actually use for this particular image. So I'm just going to go to select, and I'm going to go deselect. And what I'm going to do is we're going to actually just quickly select a rough outline around this particular jetty using the pen tool. So as I start to work my way around the jetty, what you'll notice is there are certain areas like here that won't conform to a straight line. So how do you actually create a path that isn't just a straight line? Well, what you can do is essentially, if you hold down on the next point or anchor point they're actually creating with your mouse and actually drag it to either the left, the right, the top, what you can do is actually create curved paths, as you can see here. So that is a curved path. So you essentially create paths around any shaped object with multiple anchor points. So from that perspective, it is extremely useful. So I'm just going to undo that, and we'll just continue along this sort of rough outline of the jetty, which I've just did a terrible job of actually outlining. That's better. Now once you actually create a curve, see I've created a curve along that area there, you'll notice now I have two specific points that actually define that this is actually curved. Now in order to continue on and continue with a straight path, I'd actually need to hold down Shift and Alt on a PC keyboard, or hold down Shift and Option on a Mac and click on the actual center of that line or anchor area that's there, in order to deselect one anchor point, so that I can then proceed to make the next, and the next will be a straight line. Now if I don't do that, what you'll actually notice is that by not doing that and having a curved line like this, that the next point that I click on automatically becomes curved. And so that can be really annoying if you don't know that little trick. So what we're going to do, we're just going to undo that, go to the history panel, undo that last one as well, and we'll just continue along here creating this particular selection. Now this is really rough, as you can tell, but you get the idea that it is quite simple to use once you start playing around with it to create your selections. Now I really should just magnify that up a little bit. Well, there we go, pen tool. So as you can see, I haven't done a terribly good job of actually selecting the entire jetty, but you sort of can see how easy it is to actually create a selection using the pen tool. Now once you actually create a path using the pen tool, the path actually gets saved into your paths panel, which I will demonstrate in just a second. And that's extremely useful because it allows you to actually go back and reuse paths that you create for your photographs. So for example, you may have different adjustments, but you may want to apply all those different adjustments to the same type of selection. So by actually having paths saved in your paths panel, you can actually go back and reutilize them down the track. So now that I've created this particular path, we'll just quickly zoom out a little bit. We'll jump back to fit to screen. There we go. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do what I did before, right click on the actual path that I've made. Now you have a series of different options here. You can define a custom shape if you want to, and that just saves it as a custom shape for you. But the main one you really want to focus on is not fill path or stroke path or free transform path. You really want to just make a selection. And as I said before, you can feather the selection. So if, as I've done here, I've made quite a rough selection, so I may want to feather that by about 3 pixels, just so it's not a really coarse outline of the jetty when I actually start to make adjustments. And I'm going to click OK. So now that I actually have that selection, if I go to parse, you'll notice here that I still have the original work path from the selection that I made. And that is, as I said previously, that's vector based. So that's actually not this selection that I've got here. So what we'll just quickly do, I'm going to go to layer, and we'll just quickly add a curves layer, and I'll just go OK, make a slight adjustment to the density, and then we'll just jump back here. So here we have a rasterized, basic rasterized layer mask, as you can see there, that I've created using the pen tool. But I have under the pass panel, I also have the actual path. So when I click on that, you'll see that I still have that path there as the outline of the jetty. So you can reutilize any paths that you create, and you can actually go and start from scratch once again and create, say for example, a vector mask, or make another selection based on that path that has been saved. You'll also notice that they also appear, the curves mask also appears in the channels there as well for you. So that's the pen tool. It can be extremely useful for certain situations, especially where you want to add your own personal touch and create your selection by hand. And as you can see in this particular example, it didn't take me very long to get a basic outline of the jetty from which to work with.